Okay, let's try to unpack this. Because honestly, if you've been glued to the news cycle over the last 96 hours or so, specifically looking at the messaging coming out of Washington and the Middle East, you are probably exhausted.
Oh, absolutely. It's giving people whiplash.
Yeah, and frankly, you're probably confused. I mean, we are recording this today, Thursday, February 26th, 2026. And depending on which channel you watched or which official you listened to between Sunday and yesterday, you're likely holding two completely contradictory realities in your head right now.
It really is a sort of choose-your-own-adventure reality at the moment.
Exactly. I mean, either you believe the United States is on the brink of launching a major war because Iran is, like, 7 days away from a nuclear bomb,
Or you believe the threat is effectively non-existent because the actual facilities were blown up last year.
Right. It is a massive discrepancy. We aren't talking about a minor disagreement on, tax policy or polling numbers. We are seeing a fundamental fracture in the narrative regarding war and peace at the very highest levels of the U.S. government.
And that's exactly what our mission is for today's deep dive. We're strictly focusing on a cult source that analyzes this major foreign policy contradiction that surfaced just between February 22 and February 25.
Yeah, we have a stack of reporting to get through. We've got the cult analysis, reports from Al Monitor, the Wall Street Journal, and official State Department transcripts. And the goal is to just parse out these conflicting narratives regarding uranium enrichment.
Because accuracy matters immensely right now. When the clouds of war are gathering, as they say, the specific technical facts.
Like how many centrifuges are actually spinning.
Exactly. Those facts are the only things preventing a massive miscalculation.
So let's start with the event that triggered this whole deep dive. It happened just yesterday, Wednesday, February 25. You have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and he's down in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Right, a Caribbean diplomatic trip. Usually these are your standard low-stakes affairs, handshakes, photo ops on the tarmac, that sort of thing.
Usually, yeah. But then he steps up to the microphones and drops a statement that just completely upends the narrative of the previous few days. He's asked about the Iranian nuclear program, and he does not mince words.
No, he doesn't.
He says explicitly that Iran is not currently enriching uranium.
And that is the huge headline, not enriching. To understand why that matters so much, we have to look at the mechanics just for a second. Enrichment isn't a button you press. It's a massive industrial process.
You have to spin the uranium gas, right?
Right, in these huge banks of centrifuges to separate the isotopes. If you aren't enriching, you physically aren't moving toward a bomb. And Rubio's quote was incredibly precise. He said they're not enriching right now, but they're trying to get to the point where they could eventually do that.
But he didn't stop there. He actually gave a reason why they aren't enriching. And this is where the timeline gets crucial. He referenced the U.S. military strikes from last June, meaning June 2025.
Correct. He stated that during those operations, the Iranian nuclear facilities were razed.
Razed. I mean, that is a very specific, very destructive word. It doesn't mean damaged or taken offline.
It implies total destruction.
Yeah.
Leveled. He did admit that Tehran is always trying to rebuild elements of them, which is, standard for any nation in that position.
Well,
But his core assessment is that the machinery is broken.
so they physically cannot make the fuel for a weapon because the factories just don't work.
Precisely.
Okay, so if you just heard that, you would think, great, the threat is neutralized, crisis averted. But the reason this is causing such a massive headache in Washington and why Al Monitor is flagging this as a huge contradiction is that it directly clashes with what the American people were told just 3 days prior.
Right, on Sunday, February 22.
Yeah. You have Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, and this isn't just a pundit on TV. This is the man specifically appointed by the president to handle this exact portfolio. He goes on Fox News, and he paints a picture that is basically an apocalypse scenario.
It was incredibly stark. Witkoff didn't mention anything about facilities being razed. Instead, he claimed that Iran's uranium enrichment had reached 60% purity. And then he dropped the hammer, saying they were probably a week away from obtaining industrial-grade material to make a bomb.
I really want to pause on that 1 week claim.
Yeah.
Because that is terrifying to a layperson. But technically speaking, looking at the numbers, does 60% purity mean they are really almost there? I thought weapons grade had to be 90%.
It is 90%.
Yeah.
But, and this is a really big, but in nuclear physics, getting from 0 to 60% is actually the hardest part.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that takes the most energy, the most time, the most machines. Going from 60 to 90% is much faster because you're dealing with less material and the physics work in your favor at that stage. So when an official says 60%, the implication is definitely that they are right on the threshold.
Okay, so Witkoff is saying they are at the threshold 1 week away. Rubio is saying they aren't doing anything because the buildings are gone. And then, just to make it even more complex, you have the president himself.
During the State of the Union address on February 24,
Right, sitting right in between these two conflicting statements.
President Trump stood in front of Congress and accused Iran of sinister ambitions. He explicitly stated they were actively attempting to revive the nuclear weapons program.
But sinister ambitions really just suggests intent, right? Intent is very different from capability. I can have the ambition to dunk a basketball, but the capability just isn't there.
That's a great way to put it, and that is exactly where the mixed signals become so dangerous. Al Monitor flagged this immediately, pointing out that the administration's messages are totally contradictory. You have the president and his envoy selling an imminent threat.
Like a ticking clock.
Exactly. And then you have the Secretary of State saying the clock is actually broken.
So if you are a listener trying to decide if you should support, say, a new military strike, this is impossible to parse. If Witkoff is right, we might need to act right now. If Rubio is right, acting now means bombing rubble.
It creates a massive credibility gap. If the administration wants to rally international support for sanctions or military action, they need a coherent story. But right now, the right hand is effectively debunking the left hand.
This really feels like we need a referee. We can't just rely on the political statements because they're clearly reading from totally different scripts. So this is where we need to look at the independent verification part of our deep dive. The reality check. Who is actually watching these sites?
Fortunately, the world has a lot of eyes on this. We have data from third-party watchdogs, former inspectors, and current intelligence analysis. And when you stack all their assessments up against the administration's claims, the scale tips very heavily in one direction.
Spoil it for us. Who do the independent experts agree with? Rubio or Witkoff?
They back Rubio. The consensus from the technical community is that the 1-week timeline for the special envoy is simply not grounded in physical reality.
Let's look at the sources we have. Who exactly is weighing in on this?
Well, first up is David Albright. He's a former UN weapons inspector, and he runs the Institute for Science and International Security. He is arguably one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet regarding Iran's specific infrastructure.
He knows where the bolts go.
He really does. And his assessment, which was reported by the Wall Street Journal, is that there is no indication Iran is trying to restart the program. His exact phrasing was that they're essentially at a standstill.
Standstill. I mean, that aligns perfectly with Rubio's not enriching comment.
It does. And this is completely backed up by Michael Singh from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He points out a basic mechanical fact. To his knowledge, Iran is not operating any centrifuges right now.
For those of us who don't have a degree in nuclear physics, can you explain the centrifuge bottleneck again? Why is that the key?
Sure. Think of a centrifuge like a really high-speed washing machine. You put the uranium gas in, you spin it at supersonic speeds, and the heavier atoms separate from the lighter ones. But you need thousands of these machines linked together in cascades to actually get enrichment. If those centrifuges aren't spinning, whether they're broken or the power is cut or they were raised, you cannot enrich. It is physically impossible.
So you can have sinister ambitions all day long, but if your washing machines are broken, you aren't doing the laundry.
That's a perfect analogy, and that directly refutes Witkoff's claim of 60% purity being this current growing threat. If the machines are off, that percentage isn't climbing.
But what about the 1-week timeline he gave? Let's say, theoretically, the machines were working. Is 1 week even realistic?
Experts push back hard on that, too. Daryl Kimball, the executive director of the Arms Control Association, spoke to PolitiFact about this. He explained that even in a worst-case scenario, assuming the facilities miraculously got fixed overnight, it would still take months, not a week, to enrich the amount of uranium needed for a weapon.
So the 1-week claim was alarmist even if the factories were fully operational.
It appears so. It condenses this highly complex, months-long industrial process into a Hollywood-style countdown. It creates urgency, but it totally sacrifices accuracy.
But there is one organization whose opinion probably matters more than anyone else's in this space, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, because they're the ones with the mandate to actually go in and inspect the sites, right?
They are the absolute gold standard of verification. Rafael Grossi is the Director General, and he spoke to CBS News recently. Now, he did add a layer of nuance here that is important to catch. He clarified that there is still old material in the country.
Wait, old material?
Yes, enriched nuclear material from before the June 2025 attacks. He said it's still there, in large quantities. So the stockpile isn't zero. Iran didn't just throw it away.
Okay, so the material is just sitting there. It's kind of like having a pile of wood, but no matches.
Right. And the question Grossi was asked was specifically about the matches. Is there any indication Iran is working to develop weapons capabilities right now? Are they trying to turn that wood into a fire?
And what was his answer?
A flat no.
Just no.
Just no. No diversion of material, no weaponization work whatsoever.
I mean, that is incredibly definitive coming from the guy whose entire job relies on being paranoid about this stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
So when you synthesize all of this, David Albright, Michael Singh, Daryl Kimball, Rafael Grossi, and Secretary of State Rubio, they all agree. The program is stalled. The centrifuges are stopped. The imminent threat described by the special envoy and the president just doesn't match the physical reality on the ground.
Which brings us to the June factor. We keep mentioning June 2025. It feels like if you don't understand what happened last June, you really can't understand today's news cycle.
Absolutely. The June factor is really the Rosetta Stone for this whole contradiction. The Wall Street Journal, reporting in our source stack, highlights that the Iranian program has been stalled specifically since those U.S. attacks.
So this wasn't a diplomatic pause. This was entirely kinetic.
It was brute force. Rubio said the facilities were raised. That completely explains why the centrifuges aren't running. They didn't turn them off out of goodwill, they were blown up. This context is vital because it explains the disconnect we are seeing in the administration.
How do you mean?
Well, it's possible that Witkoff and the president are looking at capabilities on paper, like what Iran could do if everything was working perfectly. Or maybe they're using the one-week rhetoric purely to maintain political pressure.
While Rubio is looking at the actual satellite photos of the damage.
Right. Rubio looks at the craters from June and says, look, they physically can't do it right now.
It's the difference between theoretical capacity and operational reality.
Exactly. But regardless of why they are saying it, the confusion it causes on the world stage is very real. And it's not happening in a vacuum, because even though the nuclear facilities are destroyed, we are seeing a massive flurry of diplomatic activity.
Right. As we're recording this on February 26, U.S. and Iranian negotiators have actually just wrapped up a third round of talks in Geneva.
Proxy talks, to be precise.
Can you explain that for us? Why are they called proxy talks?
It means they aren't actually sitting in the same room. The Americans are in one suite, the Iranians are in another, sometimes even in different hotels. And they communicate entirely through a mediator. They just pass notes back and forth, effectively.
And the mediator in this case is Oman, right?
Yes. Oman is playing the go-between. They are sort of the classic neutral party in the Middle East, the Switzerland of the Gulf, if you will. They've facilitated these kinds of sensitive exchanges for decades.
So if the nuclear program is stalled, and the facilities are literally razed to the ground, what are they even talking about in Geneva? Why is there so much tension if the bomb is off the table?
This is the real twist in the story. Even though Rubio admitted the enrichment isn't happening, he flagged a completely different issue as the main sticking point. He called Iran's refusal to discuss its ballistic missile program a big, big problem.
Okay, the pivot. So it's like, fine, you aren't making a bomb, but you still have the rockets.
Precisely. You can't enrich uranium without massive centrifuges, which are hard to hide and easy to bomb, but you can absolutely hide ballistic missiles deep inside tunnels and mountains. Rubio is effectively shifting the goalposts of the negotiation here. He expressed hope that the talks would be productive, but he is drawing a brand new red line around the delivery systems, not just the payload.
That really changes the dynamic. It totally explains why the tension hasn't just evaporated. And what is the actual vibe coming out of Geneva right now? Are they making any progress?
It's mixed. Reuters reports that both sides agreed to meet again as early as next week. And honestly, in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, simply agreeing to meet again is a small victory. It means nobody stormed out of the hotel.
It's a low bar, but I guess we'll take it.
But you have to look at the context outside that hotel room. The U.S. maintains a massive military presence in the Middle East. Carrier strike groups, air wings, the works. So you have this intense duality, polite notes being passed by Omani diplomats in Geneva, and heavy weaponry actively patrolling the Persian Gulf.
It's the classic carrot and stick approach. Or maybe more like talk and gun.
And those clouds of war we mentioned at the top, they're gathering precisely because of this duality. The contradiction in the messaging makes this whole high-wire act incredibly dangerous.
Try to put yourself in the shoes of the Irani negotiators for a second. Or even the Omani mediator.
It has to be a nightmare.
Seriously, you walk into the American room, and the special envoy might be saying, "You are building a bomb, we're going to strike in a week." Then you check the news on your phone, and the Secretary of State says, "Actually, we know you aren't building a bomb." Then the president is tweeting about sinister ambitions. How do you even begin to negotiate with that?
You really don't know what the actual U.S. position is. Is the primary goal to stop the bomb? Well, bomb is stopped. Is the goal to stop the missiles? Because that's a new demand. Is the goal outright regime change? The sinister ambitions language might suggest that to them. And when the opposing side can't figure out what you actually want, they tend to assume the worst.
They just assume you want war regardless of what they do at the table.
Exactly. And that is what leads to catastrophic miscalculation. If they think war is inevitable, they might decide to strike first. In geopolitics, chaos and mixed signals are rarely a smart strategy. They're usually a huge liability. It just creates space for accidents.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, why should you care about a quote from St. Kitts versus a quote from a Sunday morning Fox News show? Why does this actually matter to your daily life?
It matters because these narratives drive real-world actions. If the public fully believes the special envoy that Iran is 1 week away from a nuclear weapon, the public will likely support immediate preemptive military strikes. You might accept a war, with all its economic fallout and human cost, as an absolute necessity for survival.
It makes it feel completely existential.
Right. But if you look at the ground truth provided by the independent experts and the Secretary of State, that the centrifuges aren't spinning and the program is totally stalled, that urgency just evaporates. The necessity of a war right now comes into serious question.
It changes the temperature of the room. It completely changes how you interpret a headline that says war is imminent. It turns out maybe it's not as imminent as some people want you to think it is.
Or at the very least, it demands that we scrutinize the justification for that war much more closely. If we are going to pivot to ballistic missiles as the core reason for conflict, let's have that honest conversation, rather than hiding it behind a nuclear threat that might not actually exist anymore.
It really highlights the value of digging past the soundbite. I mean, if you just watched the State of the Union, you'd be terrified. But if you just read the technical reports from the IAEA and the Washington Institute, you'd be cautious, maybe vigilant, but ultimately calm.
And that is exactly the gap we're trying to bridge here today, the gap between political rhetoric and technical reality. It is so easy to get swept up in the emotion of sinister ambitions, but the physics of raised facilities is a much colder, harder reality to ignore.
Well, we are just about out of time, but I want to leave you with a thought to mull over as you watch the news cycle unfold next week. We know negotiations are resuming in Geneva in a few days for round 4.
The pressure is definitely on.
So here's the question. If the U.S. administration cannot agree internally on the basic facts of whether Iran is building a bomb, if the president and his Secretary of State are effectively reading from totally different reality scripts, how can they effectively negotiate a complex peace deal in Geneva next week?
That is the ultimate question. You simply cannot solve a problem if you cannot agree on what the problem actually is. And right now, Washington really doesn't seem to agree on what the problem is.
Something to think about as this continues to develop. We'll be watching the headlines closely to see if the narrative starts to align next week.
We certainly will.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Stay curious.
And stay informed.